Hello, everyone. I hope those of you who are seeing this today on the fast day of the 10th of Tammuz are having an easy fast, and that it's not making Shabbos preparations too onerous to be fasting while preparing for Shabbat. 2 weeks ago, during my Drasha for Parshas Vayigash, I discussed how surprising it is that Yosef, the wisest, most talented, most upright, most beloved, best looking of Yaakov's sons, is not the ancestor of the kings of Israel, and that instead it's Yehudah, a man who in his early life made mistake after mistake, who will ultimately ascend to dominance among the tribes. 2 weeks ago, I spoke about how the thing that marks the turning point in Yehudah's story, and that is the beginning of his redemption for all his moral flaws, is his ability to acknowledge his mistakes. The ability to acknowledge wrongdoing and admit one's basic inherent fallibility is an essential prerequisite for leadership, which helps explain why Yehudah, who does wrong but is able to admit it, takes precedence over Yosef, who is celebrating for not having given in to temptation in the first place. This ability to acknowledge our fallibility may be an indispensable prerequisite for good leadership, but it alone is insufficient to qualify a person for a role of leadership or authority within the Jewish people. The ability to admit our faults, acknowledge our imperfections is necessary but insufficient to make a leader. This week in Parshas Vayigash, in a single moment, Yehudah demonstrates 3 additional moral virtues, which, together with that willingness to acknowledge his faults, prove his merit and cement his rise to preeminence among his brothers. Already last week in Parshat Miketz, we'd begun to see how Yehudah was willing to stand up to people in positions of authority. He did this with his father last week, when Yaakov initially refused to let the brothers take Binyamin, the youngest and the favorite after the disappearance of Yosef, to Egypt. Yehudah put his foot down and said to his father, "If you send Binyamin with us, we'll go to Egypt and we'll bring back food and we'll all live. But if you won't send him, we can't go." And in doing this, in standing up to his father and giving him an ultimatum, he was telling Yaakov something he didn't want to hear, but that he needed to hear. But it's one thing to stand up to your own father, your own parent. It's quite another thing to stand up to a total stranger who wields power of life and death over you and everyone you love. Yehudah does exactly that, however, this week, when Yosef insists that he is going to keep Binyamin, Yosef's full brother, with him in Egypt as a slave, as a punishment for allegedly stealing a cup, a silver cup. Yosef, of course, has arranged for this cup to be planted in Binyamin's belongings in order to frame him. And faced with the possibility that he could go home a free man together with his 9 brothers, including his 5 full brothers, at the price of letting Binyamin, his half-brother, rot in Egyptian slavery. Yehudah does the stand-up thing and instead chooses to confront this man that he doesn't, by the way, recognize is his own brother, Yosef, in order to save Binyamin from him. In doing this, not only did Yehudah speak truth to power, as it were, but he also put his own life on the line for the sake of his brother. The willingness to sacrifice oneself on behalf of others, which in Hebrew we call mesiras nefesh, which literally means handing over your soul or your life, is an essential quality for anyone who would be a leader. Anyone who would be a leader needs to let their actions be guided not by self-interest, not by the desire for fame or fortune or prestige, but by a desire to serve their fellow, to serve their community, even at great personal cost. It's also worth noting that when Yehudah stood up for Binyamin, he had no way of knowing that Binyamin was innocent. Even though he did not know that Binyamin had been framed, he was willing to take Binyamin's punishment on himself as his own, not to protect an innocent young man, but to protect a young man who, for all Yehudah knew, was guilty as charged. Back in Parshat Vayeshev, Yehudah had demonstrated strength of character in acknowledging his own wrongdoing and taking responsibility for the consequences of his own actions vis-a-vis his daughter-in-law, Tamar. But this week, he takes that to another level by taking responsibility not only for his own actions, but accepting the consequences of other people's actions on himself. Anyone who wants to be a decent human being needs to be able to accept responsibility for their own behavior. What makes someone a leader is their ability to accept responsibility for the behavior of other people, to be able to say, the buck stops here. The Talmud teaches that all Jews are held responsible for one another's behavior. It also teaches us that anyone who has the ability to speak out against somebody else's bad behavior and doesn't do so shares in the guilt for those crimes. So if every Jew is responsible for the actions of their fellow Jews, all the more so someone who is in a position of leadership within the community. Thus, we've seen that in a single act of courage, Yehudah demonstrated 3 distinct and essential moral virtues that make it clear he's meant for a role of leadership. And that he and we hope his offspring after him can be trusted with the authority of the kingship. Those virtues are, as we've seen, a willingness to speak the truth, however uncomfortable or unwelcome, and even to do so to those who are in power. 2, the willingness to sacrifice one's own well-being for the sake of others, mesiras nefesh. And 3, a willingness to take responsibility not only for one's own mistakes, one's own crimes, but even for those of others. After this moment, when Yehudah confronts Yosef, Yosef continues to hold the political and material power. He's the one who runs the country. He's the one who decides where people can live, who gets food, who doesn't get food. But it's Yehudah who has now emerged as the moral and spiritual leader of the generation. This distinction between power or authority on one hand and leadership is an important one to note. Having power does not make a person a leader. Someone who has the ability to hire and fire, convict or acquit, make decisions that save lives or take lives away, has power, as Joseph did. Sometimes that power is inherited. Sometimes that power comes from wealth or a job description, or simply because people admire a person and are willing to do what they say. But being a leader has more to do with character than with power. We live in a culture here in the United States that admires and makes heroes, almost worships people who, like Yosef, are wealthy, talented, good-looking, intelligent. And sometimes those people, though not nearly often enough, also have Yosef's sense of moral integrity, though that happens all too seldom. We are less inclined to direct our admiration towards people with Yehudah's type of virtues. I encourage us to take note of who we speak of as role models or praiseworthy, both for ourselves and for others. Do we tell our friends, our children, our students about the virtues of talented artists, brilliant scholars, successful business people, powerful politicians? Or do we talk about people who give selflessly, people who speak unpopular but necessary truths, people who acknowledge and take responsibility for their own mistakes and for those of the people around them? Those are the people who deserve our admiration and our emulation. Those are the real heroes. We might not always be able to find heroes like Yehudah, walking the red carpet at award dinners or profiled in glossy magazines. To find these true heroes and leaders with the virtues of truth-telling, of self-sacrifice, of taking responsibility, we might have to look closer to home in our neighborhood schools, hospitals, governments, local businesses, nonprofit organizations. And we might not have to look beyond the obvious quote-unquote leadership roles, which I think are really power roles rather than leadership. The roles of doctors or rabbis or politicians or CEOs. To find our heroes and our leaders in more superficially humble professions. If we can begin, not only for ourselves as individuals, but in our communal discourse, to elevate the Yehudah type leaders and role models, we can shift our culture away from the worship of external power and accomplishment to focus instead on character and virtue. And if we can do that, we will all reap the benefits. Shabbat Shalom.